So hello and welcome to the opening of the Symposium 2020, a year without public space, reflections and outlook. My name is Hendrik Thieben. I'm an associate director of the School of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. This symposium is a concluding part of an initiative with the same name, basically a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic, which was organized by Luisa Bravo from the Journal of Public Space and myself, together with a great group of partners from academia and different institutions, civil society groups. Some of them are now also here in the session. So basically, this initiative started when we realized the global spread of COVID-19 early 2020, and we thought, like, how can we contribute to this situation? Me here, for example, looking from Asia, seeing how the virus spread to other parts of the world, and then linking up with colleagues in Europe and the United States, and with the idea to share experiences and approaches vis-a-vis this global health crisis. Since May, then, we organized 20 webinars with over 100 speakers, and basically try to follow how this pandemic spread. Now for the symposium, we organized the symposium event together also with the Worldwide Universities Network. We have a project together with WUN, so the Worldwide University Networks, with partners in University of Auckland, also there's Diane from Auckland in the session, and University of Sydney, and also this initiative and the symposium is also funded by COHK. Both initiatives are linked to the study and planning of healthy cities. And I think, of course, the current crisis is very much related to healthy cities. Now, before we start with the first panel of the symposium, I want to invite two people here from COHK. So one is Professor Chu, Dean of the Faculty of Social Science, and then afterwards, Professor Tung Feng, Director of the Institute of Future Cities, to give their welcome address. So Dean Chu, I give the word to you. Let me just unpin my video. So Dean Chu, maybe you can start.
Thank you, Hendrik. Dear friends, on behalf of the Faculty of Social Science of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I would like to thank all of you for organizing and or participating in this very meaningful symposium. Because Hendrik have already said all the important things. So in the interest of time, I just add a couple of my personal reflections. I think after all, reflections is the theme of this symposium. So the title of the symposium is A Year Without Public Space. This thought-provoking title inspired me to think about two questions. So first, what is public space for? So is it just space for conducting public or social activities? Well, the mission of our faculty is to, through creation and dissemination of knowledge, enhance the well-being of individuals and society. Therefore, my personal bias is to define public space as space where people collaborate to create communal well-being for the community. So second, is year 2020 really a year without public space? Now, by my definition of public space, which reflects my personal biases, of course, we are actually expanding our public space in year 2020. Why is that the case? Because the physical space that we have created for production of communal well-being continues to exist, although the access is somehow restricted because of the concern for public health. Now, nonetheless, we have increased the use of the cyberspace for the co-creation of well-being. I think that this is possibly one of the issues that will be addressed in this symposium as well. And we certainly should celebrate our collaborative effort in the persistent pursuit of communal well-being through the use of different kinds of space, physical space or cyberspace. I'm a psychologist. So as a psychologist, I also am happy to see the expansion of psychological space that accommodate communal well-being in this year. So we have in this year connect our minds and our hearts to pursue communal well-being despite the pandemic. I see this symposium to be a clear expression of this expanded psychological public space. And I'm grateful to your benevolent efforts to create this space together. Therefore, thank you very much and have a good symposium.
Thanks very much, Dean Chu. And I want to pass the word to Professor Tung Fung, who's the director of the Institute of Future Cities here at CHK and also part of the WN project with us with University of Auckland and Sydney. Professor Fung.
Thank you, Hendrik. Good morning here from Hong Kong to everyone. Understand that we have different times in different parts of the world. Okay, it's my great honor and pleasure to address everyone in this opening. The title of the workshop is Hendrik or Dean Chu, as mentioned, A Year Without Public Space, Reflection and Outlook. As I look at this title, I do have some reflection and probably some outlook. Okay. Originally, I think thanks to Hendrik and my teams, we intend to organize this in Hong Kong. In fact, we anticipate very interactive discussions in our workshop. We also reorganize visits to some of our public space in Hong Kong. And we even think about going to nearby cities like Macau or Shenzhen in the Greater Bay Area. But somehow we are all locked down, okay, obviously. Certainly the COVID-19 is affecting us in all aspects, looking at the escalating number of cases of people contracting the virus and the number of deaths increasing in your city, in my city, in your country, in my country, or in the whole globe, okay? That's make us sad. Lockdown at home without the opportunity to interact with my colleagues and students, over a cup of coffee, or in Hong Kong, over a dish of dim sum, okay? Get us a sense of loneliness, right? And sometimes happiness. We share the same feelings. But as we look at the news reporting the use of public space, I don't want me to define this. I think Hendrik has a better idea. And each one of you who are experts in the study of public space have a better idea of what it's composed of. I'm working in remote sensing, so I look at satellite image, air photos all the time, and I conduct virtual tours every day to different parts of the world. But sometimes I also look at pictures taken by media on the ground, and reflecting on this year, if you look at all those pictures or images about the public space, it seems to us that, okay, there were so many activities and memories that has been accumulated in this space. And if you look at all these images, it seems that the space is empty, right? Empty of people, empty of laughter, or empty of noises. But as I look closer at the images of the space, is it all empty? Not really, right? The buildings are still there. The traffic sign is still working. And the birds are still flying there. You can see butterflies sometimes. Benches, the chairs, all there, right? The only one that absent is us. On the other hand, there were reports that we learned from different parts of cities that the air quality index improves because we are not traveling. So we are cutting down on our carbon emissions. But anyway, looking at this space, whether they are organic or the inorganic components, they all change in time. They all have their own time span. Many of these spaces are in the cities. We understand that city is a built environment. We have very smart, talented architects, urban planners, urban designers who help us to build our cities, build our public space. But still it's composed of many different kinds of things, okay? So if I look at the title, A Year Without Public Space, I would argue that, okay, it's a year when the public space lives without us. They're all there, but we are absent for some reasons. And that reason has been lingering on with our history. So this pandemic is just one-time slots in the whole history of human beings. There were similar incidents in the history. There may be, and there will be, other incidents in the future. So that's why I think a reflection and outlook is important to look for us to understand what happened to us right now, what happened in the past, and what do we want to do in the future. I would argue that, okay, I like Martin's saying that, okay, we want to build this vibrant and healthy society looking into the well-being of every component, every single citizens of it. As a geographer, I would also like to extend that, okay, this has to be equally dealt with in the environment. And this environment includes both the organic and the inorganic ones. We are all important. We should be humble to the environment, and we should deal with it carefully. So as I look at the program of this workshop, is fantastic. Okay, we got 4 sessions on cities and health, and certainly we have a lot of experts in public health coming to this workshop and showcasing their work. I would also like to see some discussion about the environment, because that is of equally importance. Looking at what is happening in climate change, plastic waste, carbon, that all sorts of things. We have to deal with it very carefully, and we have to be mindful that, okay, we are just part of the whole system, one tiny part of it. So I could also see that there will be discussions about the government's role, the digital, the public space. I think that Bin Chu has also mentioned about the virtual space that we engage more in this past years, and certainly with the advancement of new technology in smart city, IT, so all kinds of things, we are going to use more of this technology. But how, in what way can we make a wise use of this technology to bring forth a better and healthier city? So I think that is the discussion that we want to pursue. As a workshop, certainly I hope everyone will enjoy all the talks and discussions, and more importantly, I think we would like to see more international collaborations. Hopefully we can have develop some further network, and more rigorous research activities will be done in the future in pursuing a healthier, vibrant, and better public space for every one of us. So stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tung Fung, and also this is a very relevant reminder on the role of the environment. And indeed, it's quite interesting to see how this kind of less traveling and so on is impacting our environment. Let me now just move on to the first session. So the first session is titled Reframing the Role of Public Space in the Age of Pandemics. It's basically kind of kicking off this whole topic with a number of with 4 speakers that we have invited. And for this session, I invited Miodrag Mitrasinovic from Parsons School of Design to be the moderator of this session, and he will guide us through the next 1.5 hours. Just before, one housekeeping part. Basically, if any one of you want to send questions, you can do it through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will then look at your questions, and there will be a roundtable discussion at the very end of the session, where we will go back to some of your comments and questions for the speakers. So without further ado, I want to now pass the word to Miodrag Mitrasinovic, who was also from the very beginning part of this endeavor, also as we have worked together also for some time already. So Miodrag, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you, Henrik. Thank you. So my name is Miodrag Mitrasinovic, and I am a professor of urbanism and architecture at Parsons School of Design at the New School, a university in New York City, and a long-term collaborator and friend with Henrik and Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I hope that our collaboration, despite the pandemic and the crisis we're in, continues, both online and of course in face-to-face situations. So first of all, let me thank Henrik and Luisa and the entire team for organizing this remarkable series of events that Henrik mentioned in the introduction, 20 events with hundreds of speakers under the title 2020, A Year Without Public Space. So on behalf of all of us who have benefited from your work and for your immense effort and passion for the topic and for bringing us together, thank you very much. And thank you also for inviting me to moderate the very first session of this event. It's an honor to do so, and particularly it's an honor to moderate a session with such distinguished speakers I will introduce in a moment. I just wanted to say a couple of lines in introducing the topic or the title of the session, as Henrik already mentioned. A Year Without Public Space has been a rightly provocative title, and as Professor and Dean Chiu said, a thought-provoking title, as 2020 has indeed been a year in which conventional expectations for public spaces have dramatically changed. They have changed as we learn more about the COVID-19's ability to spread and our capabilities to protect ourselves, our families, and our communities from it. It has also changed because of many of the tendencies we had recognized before the pandemic, but chose to either ignore or did not really have any power to change, have been amplified by the pandemic to the point where they can no longer be ignored and thus demanding our action and finally, ultimately change. It has also changed because we realize once again that the capacity of public space to act as a medium through which organized individuals acquire and formulate the agency to change the world is unparalleled. Even though most normative public spaces around the world have been shut down, it has also been a year in which functions and roles of public space, serves as needs of specific communities, particularly low-income communities, have been redefined through networks of solidarity and mutual aid, cooperatives and associations which produce living public spaces into the domain of what we would call everyday urbanism. But just how the role of public space during COVID pandemic has changed is the subject of our conversation tonight. So with that, let me introduce the four speakers. Diane Brand is the Dean of the Faculty of Creative Arts and Industries at the University of Auckland and a member of the New Zealand Registered Architects Board. She is also on the editorial board of the Journal of Urban Design. Her work has focused on the role of public space in the colonial urbanism of the Portuguese and British empires, and specifically on blue space, the urban waterfronts and their developments through the colonization and urbanization processes, as well as on the role of urban design and public space in natural disaster recovery in New Zealand. Seta Low is a distinguished professor of environmental psychology, geography, anthropology, and women's studies, and director of the Public Space Research Group at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Her commitment is both to research and engagement to create a more just and inclusive city. Her most recent publications include Anthropology and the City, 2019, Spaces of Security, also 2019, and Spatializing Culture, the Ethnography of Space and Place, in 2017. Professor Low is widely published and internationally recognized for her canonical award-winning work on public space and cultural diversity. Mahak Agrawal is a medical candidate turned urban planner and now environmental fellow at Columbia University in New York City. Her diverse body of work explores innovative, impactful solutions for pressing urban challenges. In different capacities, Mahak has worked with Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Town and Country Planning Organization, Government of India, Institute of Transport Economics in Oslo, to name just a few. In 2019, Mahak founded Spatial Perspectives as an enterprise that uses the power of visual storytelling and open data to dismantle the myths and faulty perspectives associated with urban spaces around the world. And finally, Vikas Mehta, a professor of urbanism at the University of Cincinnati. Vikas's research explores the various dimensions of urbanity through the exploration of place as a social and ecological setting and as a sensorial art. Mehta is also the co-editor of Companion to Public Space, published earlier this year, co-editor of Public Space Reader, to be published early next year, editor of Public Space, 2015, 101 Things I Learned in Urban Design School, 2018, and the Street, the Quintessential Social Public Space in 2013, a book that received the 2014 Book Award from the Environmental Design Research Association. So with that, let me then invite Diane to...
I just see that Diane is, for some reason, no more online. So maybe we just...
Oh, we lost her. Okay, okay. So maybe Seta, would you go first then?
Sure. Let's see. Hold on, share. How's it look? Can everyone see me? The only hard part about always speaking is we can't see anyone. So good evening to all of you from New York City. I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to take a moment to thank everyone who has been involved in this incredible endeavor that has opened our eyes and created a new kind of community around public space during COVID-19. And I today will really try to focus on what we learned about public space and social justice during COVID, in that as my stepping off place. And I'd like to cover first what COVID-19 and social distancing revealed about mostly New York City, but I think about cities in general, things that maybe we knew, but some things that we did not. Also what some of the secondary gains are from it, and talk a little bit about, and these have already begun to be mentioned, things that that we didn't expect to happen and that I call surprises sometimes, and then just spend a few moments on what I think are the most important opportunities. So let's start with public space as a resource during the outset. I know we've been talking about the closing of public space, but at least in New York City, public space was where the triage centers were. It's where extra beds were. It's where we were processing intake people. The parks were open, and many, many streets were open to pedestrians while the playgrounds were closed. And parks actually became a place where face masks and all kinds of health news was distributed. So rather than being less important, it became more. But the impact of COVID that I think is most important to understand, and indirectly then public space, is its unequal impact by neighborhood, race, class, and gender. These are maps now from June, I believe, or May or June, but they haven't changed much. These are of New York City, and I believe you can see by my marker, this is Manhattan. These are the wealthiest parts of Manhattan. This is Park Slope, right on Prospect Park, where the numbers and cases and deaths of COVID were very low. And here we have in much poorer areas in Brooklyn and in the Bronx and in parts of Queens, very dense, very high numbers of people with the illness being diagnosed. But we have a number of other things going on at the same time. This is much denser housing, a lot less public space. Streets are narrow and not being closed off. And this is one of the big reveals, I think, is that COVID in New York showed us how incredibly unequal and discriminatory our landscape is, particularly in terms of people of color and class, and to a secondary degree to gender. COVID also revealed that there were really very different kinds of people and that we shouldn't be lumping them all together. It revealed the difference between what I call the escape artists and the essential workers. And the escape artists were the wealthier residents who left for smaller towns, vacation homes, and suburbs. They were seen as spreading the virus. Nobody wanted them as they went out to their second homes. But they were like gated community, people who lived in a gated community. They were thinking about us and they wanted to get away from them them. And what's so fascinating is while we were celebrating and clapping for essential workers, they were the ones that needed to stay in their communities, were more often people of color, and they had to stay. So this whole idea of inequality in neighborhoods and the spread of disease and contagion has to do with public space, but also has to do about the ways in which people could use space to their advantage or were not able to. Essential workers were the ones using the subways, and I'll come back to the subways. Essential workers were the ones who were having to commute in crowded situations, being in the crowded streets and neighborhoods in which many of them lived where density. Social distancing was really a class privilege and became, in many parts of the United States, even a moral discourse. There suddenly was a divide between the good citizen and the dangerous other. And again, this was often structured by class, but also by the way this us-them idea that began to develop. Young people without masks, sitting on the grass, a group of men enjoying themselves were seen as dangerous, and while good citizens walking around the edge of Central Park, which you see in the second, were somehow morally good. And this moral discourse of who was good and who was bad has continued to play out, as you all know, in the United States throughout the election. But it really began, COVID really gave its beginning, and it was expressed and written large in public space. And of course, the stigma and lack of rights for older people became very apparent with a number of deaths in nursing homes, with interviews that we, Anastasia Lukiera and Sideris and I made with older people who were scared to go out of their houses. There weren't streets for them to go. There weren't safe places for them to be. They were scared to be in public space. Even when the parks were open, they were either too crowded. There were the people without masks, the dangerous others. And at the same time, it revealed the extent of homelessness, and with it, the accompanying need for safe transportation. There were 62,000 homelessness people sleeping in shelters right before COVID hit. And those shelters really became quite dangerous from the point of view of COVID. And so many homeless individuals were sleeping in subways and stations. These were the public spaces, again, where our essential workers you had to use to go to work. And eventually the subways were being closed for COVID-19 cleaning. But I think that this relationship between public space, public transportation, and a pandemic is a really important reveal from what's been going on. The fragility of mental and physical health without public space was much greater, I think, than everyone expected. The CUNY School of Public Health, many of you read about, found that people were incredibly anxious, depressed, and socially isolated. And this was, they reported each week of who was feeling what and what people were doing. During 9/11, New Yorkers turned to public spaces for solace and and public space, for all the reasons I've just expressed before, took on this ambivalent quality, so that some people didn't feel they could go into public space. They didn't find, the older people couldn't find a way to get away from their loneliness and isolation in their apartments. They were scared to go out, streets weren't safe, et cetera, so that the fragility of mental and physical health without public space is an incredibly important reveal, in that it tells us so much about the importance of what we do. And the incredible willingness to return to parks and beaches, as soon as they were open. And finally, something I guess many of you would have thought of more than I, was the dependence of small businesses on public space, and what a toll small businesses took, and restaurants in particular in New York, when public spaces closed, and how a whole new accommodation of a public-private relationship really changed. Okay, so those are, to me, the major reveals. And the dominant one is how it reveals inequality, marginalization of certain populations, small businesses suffering, how much we need our public space for our health, for our emotional well-being. It really reinforces everything we know about why public space matters, with some particular kinds of surprises having to do with mental health and economic well-being. But there were other things that I think are even more surprising, and I've called them secondary gains. For those of you not familiar with that term, a secondary gain is when someone gets sick, like has a cold, your child has a cold and doesn't have to go to school and can stay home and play all day. That's secondary gain. So you have the cold, but something else comes out of it. And that something else can be good or bad. And we've already begun to mention some of them. The cleaner air, the open streets, the amount of community care are really positive secondary gains. The appreciation for public space that I just mentioned is a secondary gain. On the other hand, the political and personal manipulation of public space and the use of public space as a way to exclude people of who could be in it and who couldn't be in it, and how people then roped off places that were their own, and the kind of taking of public space and manipulation of it was also a secondary gain that we had not seen so much. The fighting between the bicycle riders, on a positive note, secondary gain is we got a lot more bike lanes and we had many more walkable streets. But on the other hand, we also began to see new ways and strategies of manipulating the use of public space for the benefit of some populations and to the detriment of others. Other kind of secondary gain that we've touched upon already, even in our opening remarks, were about virtual spaces replacing social aspects of public space. And I'm not ready to weigh in on this, but we always knew virtual learning was going to be with us and working from home, but it accelerated that entire process. And those of us who study public space, our virtual space is going to offer the same kind of public space as face-to-face interaction. Some of us are arguing yes, and some of us are arguing no. And I should have a big picture here of Black Lives Matter, because we had an incredible amount of public protests on streets and in parks all over the United States during this period of time, which argues that the virtual in and of itself might not be adequate, so that we again see public space as playing a major role even during a pandemic. And finally, the opportunities. These are just a few of the many opportunities that I really see for us going forward and thinking about public space. The first is interesting for me as a medical anthropologist, in that I think it's time to go back to city planning as healthy planning. And I believe the introductory remarks to this whole conference pointed that out, that if COVID reminds us that there have always been plagues and that health is ultimately really at the very basis of what we do as planners and designers to make a better world for all. And the pandemic has brought this home and provided, I believe, an opportunity to think about air and space and design and social inequality and all the items that we've always considered, but really brought it home and made it possible to hone in and begin to solve those problems on a pragmatic basis. Not happening here in the United States very much, but certainly happening elsewhere. Second, community solidarity in action. We saw such an increase in community solidarity and what people could do in their own homes, in their own neighborhoods, on their own streets, to in fact create the kind of city and the kind of relationships that we really want. Here is the opportunity now that to have built these kinds of networks and built these kinds of relationships, and that we can now enhance them and work on them for the future. They are all in some way inextricably linked to the streets and the parks and the plazas and spaces of our city. And we as public space researchers and designers and planners really need to find a way now to maximize that as we begin to think of building a healthier city. I think for me personally, in terms of my own research, I never had thought about public space and the protection of the vulnerable as much as I am now. I have been writing much more about aging and the elderly, the stigma of older people, at least in the United States, and the necessity to be planning much more dramatically in our public spaces of all kinds. That includes public transportation, public libraries, public streets, public parks, public space in this broader sense, that we must be thinking about the vulnerable, whether it's children who need to play or the older people, older persons who need the social contact. We haven't been addressing it adequately, I think, in our public space work, and I think that this is one of the directions we can go to really learn from this. And finally, I think we can use history to plan for the future. I think this is an incredible opportunity for public space researchers, designers, and planners, for all of us together, to use both the history of older plagues, which we did not look as carefully, that all had public space impacts of all kinds, including the shaping of cities and the moving of bodies of the individuals in the street. Everything that we really had known about, we were not using. And this is our opportunity to come together, think about public space from a historical as well as from this moment in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So is Diane back with us?
Yes.
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 Okay. All right. So Diane, please.
All right. Kia ora tātou, and welcome everyone. We have a slightly different experience of COVID in New Zealand. We at the University of Auckland graduated 5,000 students in person this week. And we've been back on campus for some weeks now. So we're having a better time of it, but we're aware that it can change at any moment. So always vigilant. These are the symbols that have really dictated the New Zealand COVID-19 response campaign. And they're the two things that symbolise how we are going to engage with public space and who knows about it. One of them is the tracing app, which we all have to use to go anywhere in the public realm, and the other are the social distancing rules. And on the whole, compliance has been pretty good in this country with what our Prime Minister calls the team of 5 million. So urban designers have traditionally drawn figure grounds of cities to understand what public space is. And we've always drawn it as being empty, but we've always imagined it as being full. What we have now is the public space is actually being really empty or really full, because there are two typically different kinds of responses to this new kind of space. It is either avoidance or protest. So when I first started thinking about the impact of COVID-19 on urban design as a discipline, I thought, well, has anybody thought about this in the past? Are there any precedents for the way we are now behaving? And I thought, looking back, that there was a precedent, and it was designed exactly 100 years ago. American architect Frank Lloyd Wright designed a settlement called Broadacre City during a period when he had few architectural commissions. The proposal held up a mirror to dense urban conurbations such as Chicago and New York, and presented the United States with an alternative vision of the future at the 1935 Industrial Arts Exhibition. Broadacre City was designed as a flat supergrid of family homesteads of 1 acre and above, translating into an overall density of 2.5 people per acre, and I think Manhattan's typically about 100 people per acre. Factories were located under sweeping motorway infrastructure. Transportation was by driverless vehicles and helicopter-like flying machines, and connection to the world was via the yet-to-be-invented technologies such as the internet. Critical to Wright's scheme was the concept of a democratic city of equal disposition, where the dwelling and the workplace were integrated, on an ample land parcel with an economy and society that comprised of small farms or small industries, reviving Thomas Jefferson's founding and spatially generous ideal of a democratic society in the United States. So suburban living has proven to be advantageous during the current COVID-19 crisis, and I'm particularly talking from a New Zealand perspective here because we tend to have very low density cities. Families or households have been retreated into what we called here bubbles, where you had a group of people you could relate to, but you could only relate to them for several months on end while you're in lockdown. Streets were emptied of vehicles. The streets in Auckland or across New Zealand were policed by the military and the local police so that you couldn't go out of your area or out of your town. I think we were allowed to walk a 5-kilometre distance from our residence. So we tend to have larger dwellings. The suburb you're seeing there is Mount Eden in Auckland, and the house you're seeing is my own house, and the room you're seeing is the room that I've worked in during the 2 lockdowns we've had and run a faculty from. So the larger dwellings facilitated working from home for multiple members of affluent households, but as Seth has correctly pointed out, in low-income households, that has been a completely different experience, and in Auckland that has been these types of homes with maybe 10 or 15 people in them, not enough technology to use, not enough internet connection for everybody to do what they have to do, and high levels of unemployment. The gardens have provided individualised open space, and even the growth of household produce. There was a big run on vegetable seedling shops before the lockdown so that people could grow their own food. The technology's enabled us to continue to work in this situation and accommodate it. And people have been Zooming from cars, garages, garden sheds and walk-in wardrobes in my experience, along with their pets who've joined in the discussions. With driverless cars and drone delivery, still the exception rather than the rule, couriers have carefully deposited our groceries and online purchases and quickly retreated. We're now temporarily living in a quarter-scale version of Wright's dream with the technologies he envisaged on the brink of popularisation. And the public space in Wright's vision really consisted of expansive boulevards and dispersed public buildings of the sort that you might see now in Brasilia, Chandigarh or Canberra. There's no Times Square or throbbing with neon or traffic or panhandlers here. So there's a loss in impact of the cultural joys of public space. However, density is not the real central issue here, as we've seen catastrophic contagion in low-density regional Italy and minimal infection rates in high-density Taipei. It's the broader social and economic consequences of the pandemic that will shape our future more fully than the conceptual thinking of built environment theorists. Just moving on to the next part. So currently public spaces are globally facing multiple challenges. On one extreme, we have the emptiness and desolation wrought by either regulation or fear of COVID-19. On the other hand, we have government precincts bristling with protesters defending individual rights and liberties in the face of disease and death. The latter, of course, reflects the traditional mode of public space interactions. These urban crucibles have supported and cultivated waves of joy, revolution, or protest across a spectrum of international histories, and we habitually return to these sites for communal rites of discontent or celebration. Public space also has another more pragmatic function, and these are the places people retreat to when their homes are left devastated by earthquakes, tsunamis, or hurricanes. They are the sites of urban service and rescue operations and temporary hospitals. We saw this in Latimer Square in Christchurch after the 2011 earthquakes, and we saw it in Central Park, New York during the current COVID-19 crisis. Public spaces give us the resilience to survive natural and pandemic disasters as safe overflow spaces for operations critical to response and recovery. In this current pandemic, our safe places have been our homes. However, what is the plan if a pandemic and an earthquake overlap in the same place at the same time? Unsafe at home and unsafe in public space. Has our disaster planning response taken account of this collusion of viral and environmental threats? There's been a recent flurry of public space redesigns to take into account social distancing, and examples of this are Domino Park in Williamsburg in New York, showing you where your bubble can locate. All this is clever and timely in response to social distancing for safety in outdoor spaces, but it misses the fundamental point of public space. It is communal and it represents at an urban scale the aspirations, values and culture of society. I thought it was very interesting this year that in New Zealand, we commemorate our second Korean War dead in a celebration called Anzac Day. Normally it's held in a public space and it's at dawn and it's packed with people. This year, what we did in New Zealand was we were asked to stand at our letterbox and commemorate the dawn service. And it was interesting to me that even though we were confined to our residential home sites, we were asked to go to the public space, the threshold of the public space, to celebrate this occasion. So public space was still used, but we were on the very edge of it. So I believe public space is at risk. COVID-19 exacerbates questions of whether businesses will survive in sufficient volume to sustain and support a viable and extensive public realm. Will there need to be other mechanisms devised to support our public collective life? What will the post-pandemic city look like, and how will we adjust our concept of urbanism to accommodate it? Our cities need to change anyway in the face of climate change, rising sea levels and extreme weather events. The COVID-19 crisis is merely a new dimension of changes that are now urgent. In the post-COVID world, we risk losing the vitality associated. Oh, jeez. We risk losing the vitality associated with the city as a result of changes in transactional circumstances and interactive human behaviours. Will retail contraction resulting from business failure or recession? Sorry? Oh, no. Sorry about that. Will retail contraction resulting from business failure or recession strip our streets and public places of activity and surveillance? Will our downtowns and commercial centres shrink as a high percentage of organisations embrace working from home as business as usual? Will our large public buildings and icons of culture be mothballed as fears of crowds become a survival reflex? Will supermarkets and restaurants resort to click and collect? Will large chunks of learning move online? Will faith be virtual, leaving religious buildings bereft of congregations? All of the above are possible in some distorted version of our future, and some changes will be highly probable. Each loss of normal function to our cities and towns will present us with a depletion of our public realm that may erode both urban culture and a traditional sense of community. Our public realm and collective sense of urban culture and vitality is certainly going to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
And kia kaha, stay strong.
Thank you. Next is Mahak. Mahak, are you ready?
Yes, let me start the screen share. Okay, I hope the presentation is visible. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna start now. So good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone joining us from different parts of the world right now. I, Mehak Agarwal, will be talking today about the reflections and outlook on the role of public spaces in the age of pandemic, but from an Indian perspective. I would first like to thank each and every person who has been a part of this journey leading to this international symposium. I know it's been a long journey and it's been a very interesting journey to even watch out for, as well as the exemplary panel of speakers for sharing their works and Miodrag for moderating the session. So before I delve into the role of public spaces in the age of pandemics, I'd like to reiterate that much like everything else, there are various perspectives and definitions of public space. For instance, UNESCO defines public space as an open, connecting, and gathering space accessible to all. Interestingly, this 2017 definition identified virtual space as a new form of public space, and I think a space that most of us in 2020 want to take a step away from. When it comes to India, public spaces are diverse like the country itself. This diversity exists in terms of the type of public spaces, the scale of space and activity, and the relationship various stakeholders have with the public space. One of the most common interaction people associate with public spaces in India is that of leisure and cultural recreation at places of worship, monuments, or commercial plazas. But there's another layer of interaction people have with the public spaces, and that is that of livelihood opportunities. These interactions and the extent of formal or informal opportunities vary across scale, space, as well as time. One of the often ignored interaction that I believe is the capacity of public places to provide refuge to the deprived. But in most cases across India, particularly urban India, it is often tough to separate one interaction from another, for the space serves multiple functions. While acting as a matrix where everyday life can occur, these public spaces contain informal markets as well as places for spontaneous gathering. For long, these varied public spaces of India were situated in two key sections of the urban agenda. One, the culture, and second, the public health and regulation. While some of the public spaces with deep-rooted cultural or historic significance have dedicated resource allocation and improvisation plans, majority of public places in urban India fall in the purview of public health and regulation, where the focus is limited to civic maintenance and regulating the informal sector in these public spaces. In 2015, public spaces became a part of the urban agenda that was focusing on smart cities development. In the smart city mission, public places became one of the essential parts of area-based development, dedicated towards improvement of quality of life for all, including the poor. But with this mission, while the role of public spaces actually expanded, the portion of resources that was allocated or even mobilized remained low and varied significantly across the different size cities. 5 years down the line, when urban professionals and administrators were still exploring opportunities to rethink and reimagine India's diverse public spaces, the pandemic struck. In a 1.3 billion plus country where life is lived in its noisy, vibrant, lively and congested, yet somehow ordered public spaces, everything changed in 2020. Public spaces became feared spaces, places that people were moving away from or wanted to move away from. Some of the busiest places became deserted, while some others became places for monitoring and surveillance. A few months into the nationwide sheltering in place, or what is called in India as the national lockdown, people began to move back to public places. Ideas to practice physical or social distancing were chalked out in several of these public spaces at various scales and sizes. But are these circles of distancing sustainable? Can we actually expect them to work in the long run? And that too for India. And in this whole public space amid the pandemic discourse, what can we even do for the millions that are living in congested settlements for whom this spatial or social or physical distancing, whatever we call it, remains a privilege? With cities around the world re-entering into full or partial lockdowns, the need to redevelop or develop new ways to use the public places is more urgent than ever. The pandemic has in fact increased public appetite for more open spaces. Recognizing diversity of public spaces in India as well as elsewhere, and the varied interactions people have with these places and the impact COVID has had on the use or functioning of these places, some of the key steps moving forward could include leveraging the economic potential of public spaces for not just economic, but also social recovery of citizens and cities. Second, we could also explore building a network or alliance of community stewards to promote bottom-up planning for public spaces. We need to tap the opportunities created, well, unfortunately by the pandemic, for public spaces and cities to reset around equity issues. If we work smartly, I believe that this disruption could actually help drive new investments and solutions towards public spaces. We also need to think along the lines of mobilizing a stimulus package for public spaces, comprising socio as well as spatial solutions, policy interventions, and compliance by the public to work in coordination and better tackle the current health crisis and build healthier communities. And I think I'm pretty close to finishing up, but like to sum it up, the pandemic has actually highlighted more than ever before how integrally linked public places are to health and life. And on a parting note, I'd actually say that whatever the next version of normal looks like, if there ever would be a normal, some changes may be temporary, but many changes are here to stay. And one of that will be an amplified demand for healthy communities and public spaces. And on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for their time and patience.
Thank you, Mahak, very much. Thank you. So now the next one is Professor Vikas Mehta. Is Vikas, are you there? Ah, okay.
Yes. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Just checked if you can hear me properly, Miodrag. First, I'd really like to thank Henrik and Luisa for putting this series of webinars together for the last several months. It's been really immense that in this time of isolation, we've actually created a new kind of community around something that's going to be a really, really significant topic moving forward. And I think this collaboration will actually benefit us all in many, many ways. So it's really wonderful that something of such value has come out of this. Thank you again from Miodrag for the introductions and for moderating the session. I'm going to talk about a kind of an optimistic opportunity, picking up a little bit on what Seta talked about. And in my observations from a small to mid-sized city in the US, that's Cincinnati in Ohio, I call this presentation Reclaiming Public Space, and agency of the people is the main topic of my talk here as the opportunity in this time of crisis. So as we know, the immense value of public space shows up in many ways. I've just conceptualized it in these simple sort of 6 bullet points of it being a place of democracy where we can really talk about our demands, we can protest, as we've seen very, very recently all around the world. And we've also seen in the last dozen years, a continued use of public space as resurrection and clear message from various parts of the world how important public space is. But of course, we know that there are other advantages of community and social interaction, plus what we are finding now, the restorative potential of public space for our well-being, for urban health, for play, for the public health, for being in nature by ourselves or with others, and then exchange of, in terms of economic exchange, in terms of exchange of ideas. It's a wonderful place for this exchange to occur. That doesn't occur in other places in the same way. And then public space is also a really, really kinetic sort of a glue throughout our settlements. This is where we move. And in that motion, in those spaces of infrastructure, a lot of these things that I'm talking about occur simultaneously. So none of these are mutually exclusive. And then finally, sort of summing it all together, is the symbolic role of public space, how we understand, how we form identities, community identities, how we sort of create the bridging and bonding, and how we locate ourselves in the world. It's really, really tied to our sort of use and understanding of public space. But what I really want to talk today about is about this aspect of structure and agency. This distinction really comes from sociology, a little bit from psychology and philosophy. There's several people who write about the fact that the ability for us as human beings and the capacity for us to act and make choices on our own as individuals or as groups is something that you might define as agency, individual or collective group agency, which is different from this larger structure that may be available in our sort of social system, in the laws and economy, in the religion, in our customs, and it's often held in place, the structure is, by institutions. And we as individuals interact with the structure of these institutions in terms of our agency as individuals. So many, many sociologists, but just to mention a couple here, Bordeaux and Berger and Luckman talk about structure and agency loop, which seems to make sense if you think about how we behave, how we act. We have certain intentions, but those intentions then are filtered through or interacted with the institutional structures that are then responding to the individual acts of agency. So while this seems, extremely complex, it happens all the time in the actions that we create. But I want to bring this back to how this occurs in the public space. If you think about just, for a minute, these 6 conceptualizations of public space, the one place where we exercise our agency in really sort of in clarity is in the civic arena. Because to be heard, to be protesting, to be demanding for democratic issues or whatever is challenged, we have to take on agency and we have to be against the institutional structures. And so there we suddenly enact our agency in a very, very visible manner in public space. As again, we've all seen in the last several months and in the last many, many years with the Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street and so on and so forth. We also obviously use our agency while we conduct exchange, or we move in space, or we use the restorative potential of public space when we play, when we use public spaces for social interaction. But we are often constrained largely by the structures of these institutions. So and again, this is just to show you an example that this is a place that is very clear where agency is enacted, because without that, it's very, very unclear. But in other places, this agency is often muted. It's not particularly visible in the same way as it is in the civic arena. We find, especially in the West and in the US, for example, the idea of play, the idea of recreation, the idea of restorative potential of public space is actually very, very structured. It is highly programmed. And if we take a view of us as animals, and we think of how we cage ourselves in these structures, it is quite amazing. So this is the general scenario that we are seeing, and then we get to 2020 and COVID-19, and we find that much of these structured places, our libraries, our parks, our institutions begin to close, and we begin to lose this ability to use public space in the way that the institutions had structured them. Our major parks, our markets where we would go and exchange and interact, our streets where we would have generally conducted business or interacted with other folk, and even our quasi-public spaces, which are a large part of the public realm, especially in the US, are all closed. And we find all of this sort of suddenly the rug taken out from under our feet. So what is the response? And here is the optimistic message in the idea of agency of the ordinary citizen, ordinary person. So we find these, adaptations that, start to say, let's try to take some space and create support the small businesses and start to get some life back on our streets. All of these images are from Cincinnati, and it will show you sort of in a few neighborhoods how things begin to change over these few months. Parks suddenly are, not really managed. They're not, all of the equipment and everything else is closed, and people start to essentially claim agency and start to use space with the distancing in their own hands, and they take agency of these. Neighborhoods that in these, this is a streetcar suburb kind of neighborhood within Cincinnati now. We see a really, really vibrant social life happening on the streets that would not be visible at all. Here somebody brews some beer and brings a keg for anybody to come, with appropriate social distancing to partake in that. Middle of the street conversations, the idea of keeping this sort of social community not only intact, but actually much, much more active now begins to show not only in these streetcar suburbs, but inner city, center city neighborhoods, where the parking lot becomes the place to gather with masks on wheelchairs. We find play happening on these streets because the parks are kind of closed, and all kind of other social life beginning to occur on these streets, which are obviously public spaces. What is really, really wonderful to see is how children, who again I feel are structured with all these institutions, this is of course in the time when schools are closed in spring and summer, of course they're out. Everybody has a game to play, and the streets are there to do so. Soccer on the streets, bicycling like they've taken over the neighborhoods. Children in my neighborhood would play hide and seek over 800 feet, so that their territories begin to start to expand. Because again, their social distance now means they can be anywhere. And parents feel much more comfortable because there's everybody home, they can watch them. But that's really, really wonderful to see what kids make out of these territories. Of course, the gyms are closed and there's no climbing walls. And again, just to remind you, all of this is happening in one city. For the elderly that Seta talked about, this becomes a place for the walks to keep healthy. But for the young, using these historic walls in a park for the climbing, for all the exercise they were looking for, and the use of trails and so on and so forth, suddenly expands in a way that people are really taking on agency of how to use public space for all the things that they cannot do in the institutionalized sort of structured spaces. And then, of course, the ability to use this as cultural voice, not just protest. It's also a way that communities' ability to communicate in a form that is, tied together with artistic expression of events that are, of issues that are really important to the community, begin to occur all over the streets. And it's phenomenal to just watch that change, where you really don't have to go to the museum anymore. In another place, just for the final slides, music venues are closed, but using topography, quite simply in this way, concerts occur in the neighborhood quite regularly. And again, we've seen these, we've read about this in the media all over the place, but this is again coming from a small city. Just recently, the edge of a reserve, of a preserve, is used where the Cultural Arts Center puts out the whole collection of exhibition for people to then vote, which happens at this time every year. So the public space along that becomes the gallery. The local plaza allows, or lets out this place for somebody to display their arts and crafts, not as a gallery space. So the way that the space begins to get used is all these multi-dimensional ways that are restorative, that are symbolic, social, and places of exchange. So in just the final few slides, we all know that the pandemic has caused devastation, and it's not a time to romanticize this. And we all want to go back to a certain sense of normalcy, to socialize, to learn, to engage in all kinds of behavior, to go back to work, to see people, to interact. But there are lots of these lessons that come from when all of the structured ways of using public space become unavailable to us. And the streets and the ordinary spaces in neighborhoods that are not particularly programmed are available. How can we turn that around, and how can we use those with the ingenuity that we have, and how can we retrofit becomes very visible. And that to me is a very promising sign for the future of public space. Several months ago, I had looked at some of these things and compared the contraction of public space with the expansion that happened in other parts of the places and the adaptation. But to me, I think the message is clearer now that I've looked at these in many more months, is how people have actually claimed this agency. So the challenge for us is, how do we sustain this to help us adapt and generate an augmented public space in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas. Thank you all so much for your presentations. We have, and it's good, Vikas, that you're ending on an optimistic note, so we can hopefully now, frame the conversation around a couple of maybe like future-looking questions. I think there are 3 questions we have in Q&A. There are also many of the things you all talked about that I think I would love to pose questions around and go into deeper, into much more depth. Of course, I'm looking at the time, and I think we have 15 minutes left for the conversation. So let me, yes, thanks, thank you, Kendrick. So let me then use one of the questions by an anonymous attendee who asks about, it's very simple and straightforward. How would you use your knowledge and recognition of the transformation of the role of public space under the pandemic for the future design, redesign, retrofit, reimagining of the cities? And I think if this was, just to simplify it really, each of you had a bit of that in your presentations, But if you were to develop a set of criteria for the rethinking of the public space post-COVID-19, what would those be? So, because you already had a couple of in your presentation, but I wonder if everyone would actually be able to reflect on that. So if there are a couple of criteria you would use in order to design or redesign public space or cities, what would those be? Let me just give you an example. For instance, Diane talked about a suburban Broadaker city, of course, as an example, and contrasted that to the density of Manhattan. We know, for instance, if we talk about environmental concerns, and one of the questions for SETA is about environmental concerns. If we look at environmental concerns from environmental perspective, density is better than dispersed
exactly.
habitats. If you look from a pandemic perspective, of course, suburbia and dispersion is much better than agglomeration.
But
so,
that's not exactly the case. I mean, that then
okay.
We're glossing over a lot of the data. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. I mean, we're talking about density of numbers of people in an apartment and numbers of, not necessarily numbers of people in a building. I think there was been some very good research that even Michael Mahaffey has been really trying to talk about that we can have density, but we need to have much smarter density. And I think that in the redesign of the city, I think we have to very seriously be thinking about a lot more public space and much more complicated use of the street in ways, and much better thinking better about circulation and air circulation and a lot of things that we really haven't been taking into consideration. I don't think, I mean, a lot of people, and it comes out of Diane's thing, and also all the wealthy people leaving and going out, but and where there is a lot of public space. And so yes, but I think that the real no, I think that that's not the message. That really, I think we have to go back to basics and thinking about what do we know about public space and its ability to create health, and how do we look at a city and really redistribute public space in a way that makes sense, and really think about density in terms of density outside of the house, and not necessarily within a building. I mean, no, I thought that's what I was trying to say, going back to basics. Make health your criterion.
Density is not the measure, because you know, you've got very dense places like Taiwan that have got the lowest rates of infection. But I think, you know, we have to also not just think about public space, because we are going to have to redesign private space to balance out, you know, the ability to spend quality time in private space and have the choice of quality time in public space. What's the problem at the moment is the inequity of people being unable to have quality private space and also not having access to public space. So the whole design from the house, the apartment building upwards has to be rethought right to the level of the whole city.
Well, but that really means social inequality needs to be, then really the whole thing is about rethinking, you know, is about social inequality really. And because that isn't going to happen unless we have cities of greater equity.
So what if we think, if we try to narrow down, and everybody's been trying to do that, you know, for forever, is for the several months, if we talk about social inequities, behavior, and leadership. And at the intersection of these, I think we'll find some answers. You know, United States, we know very clearly now that density is not the problem. If you look at the map, it is going totally away from density. It's the antithesis of density where the problem is, because those places are a mix of bad leadership, bad behavior, and places of social injustice. There is a combination of these three things that occurs that clearly tells you it is not a density problem. You know, 1970s and maybe even a little bit earlier, a whole lot of research went into density versus crowding.
Right.
You know, the idea of the perception of how sort of crowded you feel versus how number of people per unit area of a certain private or public space, that there is actually a very different sort of metric for that, and that's called crowding. And some couple of slides that Mahak showed us talk about the aspect of crowding, where there are people living 10 people to a room, and that is a general problem of social injustice reflected in the crowding of private space.
But it's also even more complicated than that, because some people want to live in large groups or in large families too, I will point out, in New York.
Yes.
And really one of the things about transmission has been that big families wanted to get together, that this was fundamental to their sense of being alive. And so that's not even a density or crowding thing. But I don't, the thing I get upset about is those of us sitting around this table right now, or whatever we're sitting around, I imagine, are not in charge of being able to change social inequality. So I think, no, seriously, right? Or providing necessarily presidential leadership. I'm speaking from the United States into Vikas right now. All right, so, but then I think we have to challenge ourselves to say, well, what can we do? You see, I think really it's easy to say that, but I think it's much more important to say, well, what would I do in the city of New York to really change the trajectory? And there have been a number of things done. There are now guidelines of how to develop buildings that will make them COVID safe. And the Center for Active Design has really come up with 4 kinds of portfolios of ways in which you can improve, even in a high-rise building, transmission, and what kinds of filters and what kinds of ingress and egress. I mean, there are things we can do. There have been guidelines for, lightening up the number of vehicles on streets and letting streets in dense areas of the city be used as walkways and parking lots like Vikas. You're seeing that, everybody in their wheelchairs out there, or on the Upper West Side, you go out, people have their beach chairs in the middle of the street. These are things that are within our control. Taking over transportation, what do you call those, islands, and turning them into much more useful and productive public space, especially in dense parts of the city. So, I mean, I don't want us to just throw up our hands and say, oh, social injustice. I think we need to be very strategic and say what we think.
Because you wanted to say something, I
I just wanted to say that I think we need to take sort of a lens to this and find public space, because it is there. And we need to be able to appropriate it as we are seeing it happen. At least I'm seeing it happen in both sort of not very dense and quite dense places. And I think that's where the opportunity is to document this and say, look, there is place that can give us sort of a justice that is of providing public spaces for, as many people as equally as we can.
Yeah.
So one of the questions, I'm just trying to be respectful also to the questions that we
Yeah, there's 7 of them now. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So, but one of these, and both of you just touched upon, Seta talked about the beach chairs and so on and so forth. How can then this awareness that it's now being born through the pandemic be sustained? That's basically one of the questions that, one of the last questions. How do we sustain it? How do we reinforce it? How do we turn it into?
I think we build it. That was what I was trying to say at the opportunity. We build it in to the way we plan and design permanently, and using history, become much more strategic and using history to guide us, as well as imagining the future. I mean, it's true lots going to be taken care of with virtual learning and digital technology. It's true. But so that's one component. But another component is really taking the lessons that are being learned and literally legislating them into our planning codes in a very proactive way, so it's not totally forgotten. And change the values and priorities. I think we're also learning that public space has a much higher priority. Everybody's been saying it with the urban agenda, but I think the evidence is now. I keep trying to write this book, Why Public Space Matters. I don't really need to write it anymore. That's why I can't write it, because I think it's evident now. I don't think I need to say it, but I think that we could be writing into codes. But then we get into capitalist objectives of developing cities and in collusion of planning with developers and real estate and bankers and finance. So again, that's not within our venue. So all we can do is offer the best evidence and model the kinds of interventions that we think make a sense, and argue for a social justice value structure in these things. Health and social justice, maybe.
We could even end now on this note. That was outstanding. But
I wanted to say a couple things, if I may. I think one of the things would be, if you think about the brunt of this has been taken by, the people in the medical profession, people who are really, really essential workers. I think this is a time for planners, designers to really, really collaborate with people in public health.
Yeah.
Because they are already not too far from this idea of understanding the role of public space, but this would be the ideal opportunity to start really creating a collaboration with folks in public health, because the message is really, really quite clear now. Yeah. And the other part is, I think, the documentation of how people themselves have adopted and used space, does a lot. It's very hard to show somebody in Cincinnati an example of what somebody did in Zurich, because they will come and tell you, we are not a Midwestern city. But if you show them what you have done in your city, I think that's really, really, for at least I feel, will hit home. But the connection with public health is key.
And I think that's also a wonderful thing to say now in relation to this whole series of events that Hendrik and Louisa and the teams have put together, because that's exactly what, in fact, this exchange and cross-pollination of ideas was really at the core of the program. So that's and that has to be sustained. Talking about how to sustain that, we need to sustain. Mahak and Diane, would you like to add something?
I actually think, based on whatever's being discussed, we need to realize that public spaces does not really lie in the domain of planners or urban designers alone. And I think this pandemic has indicated that we not just need to expand that pool of stakeholders we are interacting with while designing or managing public spaces, but they need to be an essential part of the whole process. And that includes not just the health professionals, but everyone who is impacted at varying degrees with either just passing through these public spaces or being actively involved in these public spaces. So I think that completely changes the way we prioritize different dimensions of public spaces at various scales or various geographies.
I think just going back to the point about leadership, and I mean, one of the really important things, in my view, in the public response to the pandemic has been the ability of the leaders to communicate the science in a simple and understandable way, that so people internalize the facts and then behave accordingly. And I think where that's been done successfully, the contagion's been a lot less, and therefore the use of public space hasn't been quite so constrained. So I think it does go back to educating people how they need to behave properly in these spaces. It's not just about the space itself.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our speakers. And this is a conversation that actually can go on for at least a couple of hours, as it is just heating up. I apologize for using the wrong comparison density. I didn't mean to suggest what I said, but and it struck the chords in undesirable ways. I wanted to say something else and lead the conversation in a different way, but nevertheless, I thank you so much for your presentations and also for the conversation. And so we're ending on optimistic notes, which is given the magnitude of the challenges we face, it's a wonderful thing to do. So thank you again. So
thank
Henrik,
you. Thank you, Mino Drag. Thank you,
all.
Hendrik.
Thank you all very much.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you
Henrik,
to everyone.
Back to you.
So first of all, thanks to all our speakers, and it was great to have this kind of kickoff session and see Diane as a new speaker in our series, and also speakers that have joined before. Unfortunately, we need to move on very quickly to the next session. I put up here the agenda for the next 2 days. I won't go through everything because there's no time, but just to say there are more sessions coming, and just to explain a little bit how it works. So the next session starts at 11. So that will look at emergence of digital public space. And we have speakers, Todd Lam, who's here in Hong Kong. Then Timothy Yachner, who was first in Hong Kong and now is in Cincinnati, I think with Vikas, right? And he just published a book on digital public space. And then Manfredo Manfredini, also from Auckland, from this collaboration with University of Auckland of this entire project. Then you will see, I mean, you can go all by yourself through the different sessions. Tomorrow we have a lot of sessions, also with people from the medical background joining various discussions. And maybe I also point out we have sessions again kind of looking at innovative and creative practices. Those sessions were always very popular in our series, looking at art projects and other creative projects. Later this afternoon, we have also a panel that I'm also very much looking forward, because we haven't discussed this before, to look at campus as public space, where we have Peter Ligne, Executive Director of Worldwide University Network, somebody kind of who look at many universities at this moment and the future of worldwide collaborations and so on, and also people like Jose Escamilla in Mexico, who's doing a lot of work on online teaching and blended formats, but then also reflects on the future. Just to explain how you sign up, basically all of you that is kind of listening now, you have to basically get off this session and register for each session individually. I'm sorry that this is maybe a bit kind of complicated. It's related to practical issues that are linked to the webinar, how it's set up, and having those kind of practice sessions before and so on. So each session has its own link to come online, and basically these kind of green buttons will lead you to those other sessions. So at 11 o'clock Hong Kong time, that is kind of, I think, 10 p.m. I believe in New York, we will reconvene. And I want to thank again all of you to be part of this kind of kickoff session, and also be part of this entire series, and also as individuals, but also with your institutions, with the Public Space Research Group in New York, University of Auckland, that of course has been very important for this long collaboration now. And Miodrag, also thanks very much to you and Parsons. Last year we had the chance to be in New York, and you were our hosts, and we could go to all those public spaces. Now we had to do this all digitally. And also Vikas as a new friend now in Mahag, as people that joined this initiative. And also thanks to our team here in Hong Kong. And Tung Fung, I see is still online. Also thank you for being part of this session. So let's have a short break and then reconvene at 11 a.m. Hong Kong time if you're interested to follow our discussions. Okay, thank you very much to everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
Hendrik.